A cloud of suspicion surrounds the deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
What if the most disturbing secret in Hollywood history wasn't hidden in a movie studio, but buried hundreds of feet beneath the private mansion of Gene Hackman? Because according to sources now speaking quietly behind closed doors, federal investigators responding to the strange deaths inside Hackman's estate in Santa Fe believed they were dealing with something simple. Two elderly people, a quiet home, natural causes, nothing suspicious. But the moment agents began documenting the interior of the mansion, the scene started raising questions nobody was prepared to answer. The front entrance door was slightly open. Pills were scattered across the bathroom counter like someone had been searching for something in a hurry. One of the couple's dogs was found dead inside a closet. Two others were roaming the massive property alone. And then, investigators noticed something hidden inside the private library. A section of wall that didn't sound solid when tapped. Behind it, a concealed entrance. And according to individuals familiar with the investigation, that entrance led to a narrow staircase descending more than 300 feet underground. But here's the part that's making investigators uncomfortable. Because what they reportedly discovered at the bottom of that tunnel was never supposed to be found. The discovery of that hidden entrance changed the entire atmosphere inside the mansion. At first, agents thought it might be something simple, a storage crawl space, maybe an old wine cellar. Wealthy estates often had hidden rooms. Nothing unusual about that. But the moment investigators slid the wooden panel aside, they realized this was something completely different. Behind the wall was a narrow stone passage descending into darkness. No lights, no handrails, just a tight spiral of worn steps disappearing into the ground beneath the estate of Gene Hackman. One agent reportedly whispered the same question everyone in the room was thinking. Why would someone build this? Because this wasn't a casual addition to a luxury home. The walls of the staircase were carved from thick stone and reinforced with sections of modern concrete. Electrical wiring ran along parts of the tunnel as if someone had maintained it years after it was first built. In other words, this tunnel wasn't ancient, but it also wasn't new. It had been there a very long time. And the deeper investigators looked into the history of the property in Santa Fe, the stranger things became. Property records revealed something unusual. Before the land was ever purchased by Gene Hackman, it had changed ownership multiple times between the 1920s and the late 1960s. But many of those transactions were strangely vague. Shell companies, anonymous trusts, corporate entities that no longer existed. One local historian reportedly described the paper trail as deliberately confusing, almost as if someone had been trying to hide the true history of the land. And then investigators uncovered something even more disturbing. Decades earlier, survey teams hired to map the property had submitted incomplete geological reports. Two surveyors abruptly left the state shortly after starting their work. A third surveyor reportedly died in a car accident just weeks after finishing his inspection. Coincidence? Maybe. But when agents began descending the hidden staircase beneath the mansion, those old records suddenly felt a lot less like coincidence and a lot more like warning signs. The tunnel was extremely narrow, barely wide enough for a single person to walk through comfortably. Cold air drifted upward from somewhere deep below. One investigator later described the smell as earth that hadn't been disturbed for decades. And the staircase kept going and going and going. Minutes passed, then more minutes. By the time the team reached what appeared to be the bottom, they had descended hundreds of feet beneath the mansion. What they found there was not what anyone expected. Instead of a small underground room, the staircase opened into a massive chamber. Stone walls, arched ceilings, and rows of old wooden crates stacked along the sides of the room like something from a forgotten storage vault. Dust covered nearly everything, the kind of dust that takes decades to build up. But here's the part that immediately made investigators uneasy. Not all of the dust had been sitting there untouched. Some areas of the floor had been disturbed recently. Footprints. Fresh ones. Meaning someone had been inside this underground chamber not long before the investigation began. But the crates weren't the strangest thing inside that room. Because when agents began opening them, They reportedly discovered objects that raised far more questions than answers. One crate contained stacks of documents written entirely in German. Another contained dozens of old photographs. The images showed groups of men standing together in uniforms that historians later claimed did not match any known military force. Some photos showed meetings taking place in dimly lit rooms. Others appeared to show locations that experts have still been unable to identify. But in several of the photographs, something very specific stood out. Certain faces had been carefully cut out of the images. Not scratched, not faded, cut out deliberately, as if someone had wanted to erase those individuals from history completely. And that's when one investigator noticed something carved directly into the stone wall of the chamber. Symbols. Dozens of them. Strange markings that didn't resemble any language the agents recognized. They weren't random either. They appeared arranged in precise patterns, almost like diagrams or instructions. And standing in that silent underground chamber, hundreds of feet beneath the home of Gene Hackman, investigators began to realize something unsettling. This tunnel hadn't just been built to hide things. It had been built to protect something. Something that had been sitting beneath that property for decades, possibly much longer. And they were only just beginning to understand what they had stumbled into.
As we're learning incredible new details this hour about the circumstances surrounding his death. His front door open, scattered pills on the bathroom countertop, one dog dead in the closet, two still alive on the property.
At first, investigators believed the chamber was simply an abandoned storage vault. Old crates, forgotten documents, dust-covered artifacts from a different era. But the longer they remained underground, the more it became clear that this place had not been abandoned at all. Someone had been coming down here recently. The dust on the floor told that story immediately. Several clear footprints led from the base of the staircase deeper into the chamber, and then disappeared behind a row of wooden crates stacked against the far wall. Agents carefully moved the boxes aside, and that's when they saw it. An iron door, nearly 8 feet tall, thick, rusted, heavy enough that it looked like it had been designed to withstand something far more serious than time. But what made the door unsettling wasn't just its size. It was the way it had been built. There was no handle, no visible hinges, only a massive locking mechanism sealed into the center of the metal, like something designed to keep whatever was behind it permanently contained. One investigator reportedly stared at the door for several seconds before quietly asking a question that nobody in the chamber could answer. Why build something like this underground? Because this wasn't normal architecture. This looked more like the kind of reinforced barrier you would expect inside a military bunker, not beneath the mansion of Gene Hackman in quiet Santa Fe. And then something happened that made the entire situation even stranger. One of the forensic technicians pulled out a handheld thermal scanner to inspect the metal surface. Normally, an old sealed door buried underground would show almost no temperature variation. But this one did. The device detected faint temperature differences along the edges of the door, meaning something on the other side was affecting the airflow, which could only mean one thing. There was space behind it, a large space. Air was moving somewhere beyond that wall of iron. In other words, the tunnel didn't end here. Whatever lay behind that door continued deeper underground. The room fell completely silent when that realization hit, because suddenly the chamber filled with crates didn't feel like the main location anymore. It felt like a waiting room, and the door, that felt like the real entrance. But before anyone even attempted to examine the locking mechanism, another discovery shifted the entire investigation in a different direction. Inside one of the final crates agents opened, investigators reportedly found a leather-bound ledger. The book looked old, extremely old. The pages were fragile and yellowed with age. But what shocked the team wasn't the age of the book. It was what was written inside. Every page was filled with names, dates, and large financial figures, all written in German. Some entries dated back to the late 1940s. Others appeared decades later. The numbers next to certain names were enormous, amounts that, adjusted for modern value, would equal millions of dollars today. Payments, transfers, transactions. But there was no explanation for what the payments were for. And several of the names listed in the ledger raised immediate alarms. Because according to preliminary database searches, a number of those individuals had either disappeared from public records entirely or were connected to organizations that no longer officially existed. One agent reportedly flipped through the pages in silence before saying something that made the rest of the team pause. "This doesn't look like storage records." He closed the book slowly. "It looks like a ledger. A ledger of people, of money, of operations that someone clearly never expected to be discovered beneath the home of Gene Hackman." And the deeper investigators looked into those names, the more unsettling the story became. The moment investigators began analyzing the names inside that mysterious ledger, the entire investigation took a darker turn. Because several of the entries didn't just look suspicious. They looked dangerous. Within hours, federal analysts cross-checked a handful of the listed names through international databases. What they found reportedly left the room silent. Some of those individuals had connections to powerful financial networks that operated quietly after the end of World War II. Others were linked to secretive organizations that historians believed had disappeared decades ago. And then there were a few names that were even more disturbing. People who, according to official records, were supposed to have died long before the ledger entries were written, which raised a chilling possibility. Whoever maintained that underground vault wasn't just recording history. They were documenting something ongoing, something secret, something that may have continued for decades beneath the estate now owned by Gene Hackman. But investigators soon realized the ledger wasn't the most unsettling discovery in the chamber. Because while agents were cataloging the contents of the crates, one forensic photographer turned her flashlight toward the far wall of the vault. And that's when she saw them clearly for the first time. The symbols. Hundreds of them carved into the stone surface. Not random scratches. Not graffiti. These markings had been etched with extreme precision, each line carefully cut into the rock as if whoever created them knew exactly what they were doing. Some symbols resembled ancient alchemical diagrams. Others looked more like mathematical schematics. Complex geometric patterns arranged across the wall in rows. But a few of the carvings caught the attention of one outside consultant who later reviewed the photographs. An astrophysics researcher studying the images reportedly noticed something strange. Several of the diagrams appeared to resemble star maps, charts of celestial positions. At first glance, the patterns didn't match any modern astronomical records. But after weeks of comparison, the researcher made a statement that quickly spread through investigative circles. If those star patterns represented real constellations, they corresponded to positions that would only align thousands of years in the past, or possibly thousands of years in the future, which made absolutely no sense. Because whoever carved those diagrams into the stone would have needed knowledge of orbital mechanics that scientists didn't formally understand until the modern era. And that discovery brought investigators back to the iron door at the far end of the chamber, the one without a handle. The one with airflow detected behind it. Suddenly, the question wasn't just what had been hidden in the crates. The real question became something far more unsettling. What exactly had been sealed behind that door? Because the deeper authorities dug into the history of the land beneath the mansion in Santa Fe, the more geological data suggested something unusual. Subsurface scans from decades earlier hinted at hollow spaces extending far beyond the vault chamber. Large underground cavities stretching deeper into the earth. In other words, the tunnel beneath the home of Gene Hackman might not be a single passage at all. It might be part of a much larger underground network. And according to one anonymous investigator, the most disturbing part of the entire discovery wasn't the ledger, the crates, or even the symbols carved into the walls. It was the simple fact that the iron door remained sealed. Authorities have never publicly explained why they chose not to open it. No official statement. No confirmation of what lies behind it. Just silence. Which leaves one terrifying question hanging in the air. If investigators were willing to document everything else they found beneath that mansion, why is the one door that leads deeper underground the only thing they refuse to talk about? And that brings us to the question that still hasn't been answered. If everything investigators discovered beneath that mansion was already disturbing, what exactly is hidden behind the one door they refuse to open? Because according to multiple sources close to the investigation, The underground chamber beneath the estate of Gene Hackman in Santa Fe was only the first layer of something much deeper. The crates have been removed. The ledger is now reportedly in federal custody. The photographs are being analyzed by specialists. But the iron door? Still sealed. Still untouched. And that decision alone has fueled a storm of theories online. Some researchers believe the chamber may connect to a much larger underground network that predates the mansion itself. Others think the vault was part of a Cold War-era bunker system that was quietly buried beneath private land decades ago. And then there are the people who believe something even stranger, that whoever built that tunnel didn't intend for it to ever be found. That the symbols carved into those walls were not decoration but warnings. Warnings left behind by people who understood exactly what was buried beneath that property. Because here's the truth investigators haven't explained. If the tunnel was simply an old storage vault, why install a reinforced iron door without a handle? Why carve hundreds of complex symbols across the chamber walls? And why does thermal imaging still detect airflow from whatever space lies on the other side? Something is down there. Something authorities clearly know more about than they're willing to admit. So now the question goes to you. What do you think is really hidden beneath the former estate of Gene Hackman? A forgotten Cold War bunker? A secret archive buried decades ago? Or something far more disturbing that investigators are afraid to reveal? Drop your theories in the comments below. And if you want more investigations uncovering the stories powerful people don't want you to hear, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because the deeper we dig into stories like this, the stranger they become.